Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I love this time of the year. We're going to talk about my favorite handhelds of 2025. And it feels like this is the best time to get into handheld gaming. We've got so many different options, and we've seen a lot of advancements this year, both on the high end as well as the low end. We've also seen the rise of a completely new form factor, dual-screen Android-based handhelds, which are pretty awesome. There have been some big advancements in software too, to the point where now some of these handhelds are viable PC game alternatives. And so in this video, we're going to break down each of my favorite handhelds by category with a couple honorable mentions as well. So grab your favorite snack and drink, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we jump into it, I've got a few ground rules. Number one is that each of these devices have a full review on this channel, so if you want to hear more about each of them, I will have them linked down below. It's also worth noting I don't consider this to be a best of 2025 video, and that's because they're my own personal favorites, and your own favorites might be different than mine, and that's totally fine. So it's not that any of these devices are definitively the best, but rather just my favorites over 2025. Speaking of which, we're mostly going to cover devices that were covered in calendar year 2025, but then also some that were late 2024 releases, just because I needed more time to really enjoy them, and so they're going to be on this list too. And then finally, like I mentioned before, I'm going to have honorable mentions for each of these categories as we go through. So our first category is going to be my favorite risky handheld. And the idea here is that I really appreciate it when these companies take a risk and try something new, even if they don't stick the landing. So for each of these devices, I wouldn't really consider them to be a success or even really a favorite of mine, but I appreciate the fact that they even tried. The first honorable mention goes to the One X Sugar. This thing is a dual screen monstrosity. The whole concept of this handheld sounds pretty crazy. It's got flip-up controls and flip-up screens, and it kind of feels like a transformer, and you have multiple different ways that you can enjoy it, either with a single screen or dual screen or flip it around and so on. And I feel like it's a really bold design. I appreciate the fact that this company just really went into left field and tried to find something that was unique and new, and they definitely nailed that. But unfortunately, the practice of actually using this device is kind of a nightmare. The software doesn't work very well, and none of these positions are that comfortable anyway. But all the same, I think it's worth celebrating the fact that this company tried to make this thing in the first place, because I think it paves the way for other innovations in the future. Another honorable mention that I think is maybe just a little bit ahead of its time is the GPD Win 5. And this is the first handheld PC with AMD's Strix Halo chip inside. In fact, this is the most powerful handheld that you can buy right now. But there are some design choices that leave me scratching my head, like the detachable battery pack on the back of it. It's also got a fairly lackluster display, considering that this thing starts at $1,500 and goes well beyond $2,000 depending on the spec. But all the same, I do really love that Strix Halo chipset. It really does eat through performance when it comes to the hardest to play games. For example, when playing God of War Ragnarok on battery power, which only goes up to 45 watts, you can still get around 90 frames per second at 1080p medium settings. And it is a shame that I don't really enjoy playing this device in handheld mode, mostly because with the battery included, it's one of the heaviest handhelds I've ever used. Instead, I've been playing it plugged into the wall. That gives me a higher TDP, so more performance power, and then I don't have to worry about that heavy battery as well. And with this setup, it is a 1080p powerhouse. You can play any game you can think of at the highest settings possible, and it's still going to be very, very playable. At the same time, the fact that I am tethered to a wall plug doesn't make it feel like a very handheld experience in the first place. And so I love the fact that we have a powerful chipset in a handheld, but I think that there are going to be better implementations in the future. When it comes down to it, my favorite risky handheld was this one, the Anbernic RG Slide. The design of this handheld is reminiscent of a bunch of old school devices like the PSP Go, the T-Mobile Sidekick, or the Sony Xperia Play. And when this thing was first announced, I was pretty excited. I didn't really own any of those devices back in the day, so it's pretty cool to have a 2025 version. However, the RG Slide very much so feels like a Generation 1 product. It's a lot thicker than you may think, and it is exceedingly heavy for its size. Now, I'll give credit where credit is due. It's a very sturdy handheld because it's got a metal plate on the back of it, but that adds a lot of weight to the overall experience too. And so you end up with a really chunky experience that looks a lot better than it actually feels. Now, Anbernic debuted a new display on this device, and it's awesome. We'll also see it throughout the rest of this video. It's 4.7 inches with a 960p resolution and a 120 120Hz refresh rate. It is a wonderful fit for retro gaming. And so the visual quality of playing retro games on the RG Slide is unmatched, but the actual experience of playing them is quite flawed. The controls are very low on the device, which makes it feel awkward, but then also the top is a lot heavier than the bottom, which gives it a weird top-heavy feel. And so this is why it's my favorite risky handheld of 2025. I love that they went with this new design, and I hope they iterate on it in the future, but when it comes to actually playing the device, I don't really enjoy it that much. Okay, moving on to our second category, we're going to talk about my favorite budget option. Now, the concept of a budget handheld will really vary depending on the budget that you have. So I've got two different choices for this category, one that's under $100 and then one that's under $50. Let's start by talking about the devices under $100. And my runner-up here is the Ayaneo Pocket Air Mini. And at first glance, this has all the features that you would expect in a much more powerful handheld. It's got a 4.2-inch 960p resolution display, and it's also got active cooling and a decent chipset, enough to be able to play up through PSP with no problem, and a smattering of GameCube and PS2. In addition, it's got good ergonomics and decent controls, and it comes out to under $100. It's usually around 80 or 90 depending on the spec that you get. Now, it does cut some corners. It's only got 3 GB of RAM max, and I think the screen could be a little bit more vibrant, but for the most part, I think it's a decent handheld. And if you're looking for a fairly powerful 4:3 aspect ratio device, I think this is your best bet under $100. However, my favorite budget handheld under $100 is this one here, the Mangmi Air X. This company just came out of nowhere and debuted with their very first handheld that kind of feels like a budget version of the Retroid Pocket 5. This one's got 4 GB of RAM and a 1080p 5.5-inch display, and it's also got a Snapdragon processor. It's the 662, so not the most powerful in the world, but it's still very decent. And it's surprising that this is the company's very first handheld, because it's super well built. It feels like it's made by a company who's been in it for a long time. Like with a lot of other high-end devices, it's Android-based, which gives you access to a bunch of different apps and front ends and emulators as well. And the widescreen aspect ratio does open up a bunch of opportunities for playing a lot of your favorite retro games with widescreen hacks, and so I've really enjoyed this overall experience. It's also got excellent controls, and probably one of my favorite use cases for it is that it plays just about every PSP game with an upscaled resolution easily. And I've been waiting years for a decent PSP emulation handheld that's under $100, and we finally got it with the Mangmi Air X, and so this is why it's my favorite budget option at this price point. But like I said, the idea of a budget handheld will really depend on your own budget, and so my favorite choice under $50 is this one, the Battle XP G350. Now the thing about this one is that it has identical shells and buttons to other Anbernic devices, even though it has a different sub-brand name, Battle XP, but I'm pretty sure that this was actually made by Anbernic themselves. And it's not a very special handheld in many ways. It's using the RK3326 chipset, much like other clone devices like the R36S, but this one just feels a lot more polished and pristine. And given the fact that you can easily find this device for around $35, that's what sets it apart from the pack, the fact that it's a pleasure to actually play. You can find plenty of handhelds with a similar shape for under $40, but I think this one stands ahead above the others just in terms of controls. And given that there's been a long development cycle for this chipset, you have plenty of custom firmware options as well. My personal favorite is ArcOS, and that's what I've been using on my Battle XP G350. So at the end of the day, this one is an excellent entry point if you're looking for something on the cheap, but still a very decent experience with a lot of software development behind it. It's certainly not going to win any awards in terms of innovation, but this thing is actually a lot of fun to play, and so that's why it's my favorite choice for under $50. Okay, our next category is my favorite everyday carry. These are going to be devices that are easy to throw in your pocket and easy to get in and out of your game. My first runner-up is the TrimUI Brick. This one came out in late 2024, but it really didn't come into its own until this year, and so that's why I'm putting it on my list today. Now, like with other TrimUI devices, it's got decent controls, but what sets it apart is its display. It is 3.2 inches with a resolution of 1024 by 768. It is ultra sharp and crisp. And this combination of decent controls and excellent display, as well as a smaller size, makes it a really pocketable everyday carry sort of handheld. It's not something I would consider to be a primary handheld. I wouldn't want to play this sitting on the couch, but it's really great to grab and go. It's got a decent amount of power to it as well. You can play up through PS1 no problem, and a smattering of the other systems too, but I generally use it for retro gaming, and I found it to be a pretty good fit. However, with my everyday handhelds, I like to chuck them in my pocket, which means that I prefer the clamshell form factor just because it's self-protecting. For the first half of the year, I use this thing. It's the Miyoo Flip, and this is actually a pretty decent everyday carry handheld, but has some significant flaws. Let's talk about the good stuff first. It's decently powerful, and it also has probably the best controls that I found on a clamshell to date. The buttons and the D-pad are the closest to actually feeling like an original Game Boy Advance SP, and so they are a true pleasure to actually use. I also love the overall size of this thing. It's almost the exact same dimensions as the Game Boy Advance SP, which makes it just feel very nostalgic in the hands. We've also got a few firmware options that'll help you customize your overall experience, and so yeah, I've enjoyed this one a lot over the first half of 2025. However, if you've seen any of my other videos about this device, it's also one that I cannot recommend, and that's because it's had a lot of hinge issues over the past year. Buying this device kind of feels like a gamble. You might get one that has no hinge issues like my yellow one right here, but you might have others that will break on the first day or the first week or the first month. And so unfortunately, the quality of this hinge prevents me from recommending this device, but I did really enjoy my time with it because I got lucky and had one that didn't break. And thankfully, we had another challenger from the exact same company that dethroned the Miyoo Flip. It's this one right here, the Miyoo Mini Flip. So this guy is basically the same as the original Miyoo Mini that came out about 4 years ago, but they added Wi-Fi and of course they gave it a clamshell form factor. And the beauty of this one is because it has the same chip as the Miyoo Mini, you can use all the same software as the original Miyoo Mini as well, including Onion OS. Now this one is quite small. It's a 2.8-inch display, so again, I wouldn't consider this to be a primary handheld, but I love the fact that it gets so small when you close it up, and it's so easy to throw in your pocket. It's also got decent controls, not quite as good as the original Miyoo Flip, but very close, and so I've enjoyed the overall experience of playing this handheld. As far as operating system, I've been keeping it very simple and limiting myself to just 5 games on MinUI, and this has been an excellent experience for me because it keeps me very focused on the games instead of browsing to see what I want to play next. And I think that's the ultimate way to play with an everyday carry handheld. You can just chip away at those 5 favorite games, and when you're ready, you can swap them out for others. And I love the fact that this thing is just so small and pocketable and easy to use. The clamshell experience also is super awesome, being able to close it and put it to sleep immediately and then open it up and jump right back into your game. All of those make this my favorite pick. Okay, my next category is my favorite retro handheld. The idea here is that there are some handhelds that are more focused on playing retro games specifically. So your 8-bit systems, your 16-bit systems, but improving that experience as much as possible. Really good controls, really good visuals, and so on. I've got a couple honorable mentions here. We'll start with the Anbernic RG477M. And this kind of feels like a culmination of all the different handhelds that Anbernic has made in the past. It's got a similar design to what we've seen over the past several years, and it has this beautiful metal shell as well. The display is also the same as on the RG Slide, so 4.7 inches, 120 Hz with a 960p resolution. And so this combination works really well. Tried and true retro-focused controls and that premium feeling metal shell. And then of course a display that gives you a lot of options, including high-end shaders and scaling options, as well as things like black frame insertion or subframe BFI. And there have been many times throughout this year where I've picked up this device and started playing a retro game and I thought to myself, man, it really doesn't get better than this. And so this is why it made my honorable mentions. The reason why it's not my #1 pick is that it's also a bit of a double-edged sword. It's got the Dimensity 8300 chipset inside of it, which is quite powerful. In fact, you can play the vast majority of GameCube and PS2 games on this device at a 2x resolution scale, which is going to perfectly match the resolution of the display. But when you combine this chipset and a metal shell and this display, it does get quite expensive. We're looking at a $250 handheld that is primarily focused on retro games. So I think for those who do end up picking up this device, they're going to love it, but I also think that it is quite expensive for what it does. Now, just a month after that last device came out, Anbernic released another one that was very similar, but improved in many ways. This one is called the RG476H. It's got a plastic shell to it, making it a lot less heavy, and it also has stacked shoulder buttons, which make it more appropriate for certain games. It's also got the same display and very similar controls too, and so this one also feels like the ultimate retro handheld, but maybe a little bit more ultimate just because of that plastic shell. And so even though I do love that RG477M, it kind of felt like overkill, especially at that price point, whereas this one feels like a bit of a better fit. It's got a weaker chipset, the Unisoc T820, but it's still got plenty of power for your favorite retro games, including some shaders on top. It can also play a decent amount of GameCube and PS2 games, just not quite as much as that previous device. But the great thing about this one is it's about $100 cheaper, so this is around 150 bucks. And so in terms of Anbernic handhelds that are focused on retro gaming, I think the RG476H is a more suitable fit for this price point and the amount of games that you can play. And it was very close to being my favorite pick in this category, if not for one other handheld, the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2. Now this one's kind of a wild card. The Retroid Pocket Mini version 1 came out last year, and honestly, I wasn't a huge fan of it. In fact, it became my favorite disappointment of last year. And there was a lot of drama about the original Retroid Pocket Mini earlier this year. It turns out that Retroid had basically lied on their spec sheet and said this was a 4x3 device, but they were actually adding bezels to an 8x7 display. And once the truth came to light, there was a huge backlash and a bunch of people canceled their orders and got refunds, and it was a huge mess. Now the silver lining to this whole debacle is that Retroid ended up making a version 2 of the Retroid Pocket Mini with that original display with no modifications, and it turns out this display is awesome for retro gaming. And so when all is said and done, using the original screen really transformed the experience of the Retroid Pocket Mini to the point where I love playing this thing with retro games. It's got a 3.92-inch AMOLED display with a resolution of 1240 by 1080, and it does have an unconventional aspect ratio of 31 by 29, but that does work out well for most retro games. Game Boy and Game Boy Color games look especially nice and vibrant, and they're just very fitting on a taller display like this. And 4x3 games look very good, but I've also found that blowing them up to an 8x7 aspect ratio doesn't stretch them too much, but also still fills out the screen, and sometimes will give you integer scaling with systems like Super Nintendo, TurboGrafx-16, and the regular Nintendo 2. And so even though I wasn't hot on the original Retroid Pocket Mini, the version 2 has completely transformed that experience to the point where it's my favorite retro handheld. It's got the Snapdragon 865 processor inside, which is pretty decent. It allows you to play most GameCube and PS2 games, and GameCube is a real joy to play too. In the Dolphin emulator, you can use widescreen hacks to make it taller instead of wider, and it actually will fill out the entire display without distorting the image. And so GameCube is one of my favorite things to play on the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2. And so putting that all together, this is why it's my favorite retro handheld. It's got a beautiful display, excellent controls, and nice ergonomics, and it is still quite small, and so this is my favorite little mini retro handheld. Okay, for my next category, it's going to be my favorite vertical handheld. These are going to be devices that are shaped more like the original Game Boy. I've only got one runner-up here, and it is the TrimUI Brick, the same handheld we were talking about when we discussed everyday carry handhelds. And I think if you are looking for a small vertical handheld that came out around 2025, this one is probably my favorite choice, just because we've got a lot of different custom firmware options for it, and we have that bright and beautiful display. But for me personally, it's a little bit too small to be a primary handheld, and therefore I didn't pick this as my favorite vertical handheld. Instead, I was looking for one that's a better all-arounder. And in that regard, my favorite vertical handheld of 2025 was the Retroid Pocket Classic. I feel like this one is a modern Game Boy in all the best ways. It's got a similar shape and size to the Game Boy DMG, but also has a bump on the back like the Game Boy Color, which makes it very comfortable to hold. We've also got a ton of different color options for this device, which makes it more fun and personalized. The processor in here is quite powerful too. It's the Snapdragon G1 Gen 2, which means that you will be able to play through the retro classics no problem, and it's even powerful enough to be able to play some high-end stuff like GameCube and PS2. It's also got the exact same AMOLED screen as the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2, so it's got a taller aspect ratio. It's going to make it an excellent fit for Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and even Game Boy Advance looks awesome on here too. It's also worth noting there is a 6-button option for this one too, so if you want to play some classic arcade games or some retro Sega games, this will be an excellent fit. The major shortcoming of the Retroid Pocket Classic is a little bit ironic, but it's so powerful that you can play systems like GameCube and PS2, but it doesn't have any analog sticks, which prevent you from really fully realizing the control potential on this handheld too. So instead, I found that the best way to get around that is to just focus on playing retro games with this, because it does a brilliant job with those, and so that's primarily what I play with the Retroid Pocket Classic. It's also got excellent price to performance, under $150, and so combining all this together is why this is my favorite vertical handheld. Now, the other side of that coin is my favorite horizontal handheld. So these are going to be devices that are shaped more like a Nintendo Switch with the controls on each side of the screen. There were plenty of good releases this year, but I narrowed it down to just 3. And my first runner-up is the AYN Odin 2 Portal. This one is essentially a larger and better version of the original Odin 2. It's got the same Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor inside, but it's got a larger display. It's 7 inches and it's AMOLED, 1080p, and it also has a 120Hz refresh rate. And so this one is very impressive with a big, beautiful display and a high-end chipset. My only main initial complaint about this one were the ergonomics, which felt very flat, but thankfully the company sells their own TPU grip, which makes the ergonomics a lot more satisfying. And so I did find I had to add the grip to make it more comfortable, but after that it was smooth sailing. And this handheld's an easy recommendation if you want something powerful with a big, beautiful display, because games will just pop on it, and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is a very compatible chipset. You'll be able to play things like Nintendo Switch pretty darn easily. I also think it is an excellent streaming handheld, both with local PC streaming as well as playing over something like NVIDIA GeForce Now on the cloud. And so this is another great option too if you want something a little bit more lightweight than the Steam Deck, but still a very impressive controller and screen experience. But another thing I learned this year is that a 7-inch display on a retro handheld is a little bit overkill for me. I prefer a 6-inch display just because those devices tend to be a little bit more portable. And that leads to my next honorable mention of horizontal handhelds, the AOYN Odin 3. This one is the successor to the Odin 2 line and it has a more powerful chipset, the Snapdragon 8 Elite. It's also got a 6-inch AMOLED display that runs at 120 Hz, so a lot of the same features of the Odin 2 Portal, but in a more compact size. And I do really like this device, but I think it's going to get a lot better in 2026, to the point where it might actually show up on that list next year. The big downside of this chip as of making this video is that we don't have third-party driver support, and so compatibility with this chipset is actually worse than the Odin 2 devices when emulating systems like Nintendo Switch and Wii U. Instead, it really shines when playing PC games because you can use a lot of that extra power and a lot of these games play great. But this is one of those wait and see kind of handhelds where I think that 6 months from now it's going to be a much better experience. So it gets an honorable mention here today, but it might get something a little bit better next year. When it comes down to it, my favorite horizontal handheld experience this year was the Conker Pocket Fit. This is a sub-brand of Aya Neo that is meant to be more budget-minded, and they really nailed it with their first release. This one's got my preferred 6-inch display. Even though it is only LCD and not OLED, I still think it looks great, and it has a high refresh rate too. It's also got excellent ergonomics and controls, to the point where I find it to be more comfortable than the Odin 2 Portal and the Odin 3. This one also has my favorite overall processor of 2025, the G3 Gen 3. This is a gaming-focused version of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, so it's more powerful than the Odin 2 devices, not quite as powerful as the Odin 3, but it has all that great compatibility. And so this feels like a device where I can have my cake and eat it too, where I've got this high power and high compatibility. I can play stuff like Nintendo Switch on this better than on the Odin 2, which is pretty crazy. It also does an excellent job playing PC games via apps like GameHub and Game Native, and so you're able to log into your Steam library and play some of these lightweight favorites, and this has been the main way that I've played some of these games. The only major downside of the Conker Pocket Fit is of Aya Neo's own making, and that they can't fulfill their orders for some reason. They've had a hard time shipping any of these out. And so as I'm making this video, there are hundreds and hundreds of people who are still waiting for their device to ship, and that's really unfortunate because I think it's a great value for its price point, and the hardware itself is excellent. It's just a matter of getting it into people's hands. At the end of the day, from a hardware perspective alone, this has been my favorite horizontal handheld of 2025 by a long shot. And I think that if this company does a better job of actually shipping out their devices, a lot of people are going to feel the same way too. So yeah, this one's an excellent little handheld that just needs to ship to its customers. Okay, sticking to form factor, our next category is going to be my favorite clamshell handheld. These are going to be the devices that have a hinge and can close up. Earlier this year, we got a really excellent device. It's the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. This is essentially the Retroid Pocket 5, but in a clamshell form factor. It's got the same chipset as the Retroid Pocket 5, the Snapdragon 865, which does a decent job playing all the way up through PS2 and GameCube. And so this is an excellent mix between retro gaming and some of the more modern stuff too. And the nice thing about it only being a single screen device is that it's got plenty of room to position the controls in the most ergonomic way, and I think they really nailed it with this release. I found it surprisingly comfortable when playing twin stick games in particular, and so this has been an excellent fit overall. The reason why it's not higher on the list is because it did have some hinge issues earlier this year. There were plenty of customers who had to return or replace their handheld. They've got a new design now which seems to be working a lot better, and I've been lucky in that I haven't had any hinge issues with mine, but it is one thing worth noting and why it's not my top pick for this year. Another clamshell that deserves an honorable mention is the Anbernic RG34XX SP. This one looks a lot like the Miu Flip that we were talking about earlier, but it comes with a different display. It's 3.4 inches and a 3x integer scale of original Game Boy Advance. It's also got the same shell dimensions as the original Game Boy Advance SP, and so it kind of feels like the ultimate Game Boy Advance experience in a clamshell. I personally think that this screen isn't the best for other retro systems. I think that a 4:3 aspect ratio would have been better, but if you want something with that true Game Boy Advance experience, I think that this one is top notch. So in other words, if you're looking for an upgraded Game Boy Advance SP, this is an easy choice right here. But when it comes to an all-around clamshell, I think there are better options out there. And that finally leads to my favorite clamshell device of 2025, and it's probably not going to be a surprise for most longtime viewers of this channel. It's the AYN Thor. Like I mentioned in the intro, it seems like this has been the year of dual-screen handhelds. We've seen a bunch pop up, and the AYN Thor is easily my favorite of the bunch. This one's got two AMOLED displays. The top one is 6 inches and goes up to 120 Hz, and the bottom one is actually the same display that we've been seeing throughout this video. It's the one on the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2 and the Retroid Pocket Classic. And there is something magical about this little device that looks kind of like a 3DS, but then when you open it up, you're like, holy smokes, this is a 2025 handheld. Those OLED displays are right in your face, and we've got some excellent controls as well. This one's running the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, so the same processor on the Odin 2 line of devices, which means it's going to be able to play the vast majority of 3DS games at an upscaled resolution, and playing these games at a 1080p upscale is pretty crazy. It's not a perfect 3DS experience. For example, the aspect ratios don't perfectly line up to that particular console, but for me, I think it is good enough, and it's been a really excellent way to play these systems. And of course, even though it is a 2-screen handheld, you're not just limited to 2-screen gaming. This thing is going to be awesome for single-screen games as well. Basically, anything that you can play on a lot of these higher-end Android devices can also be played on the AYN Thor. And so this is a handheld where everything comes together nicely. It's got an excellent processor with good compatibility, and then 2 beautiful displays and decent controls. It's not a cheap handheld. The starting price is $300, but it is kind of amazing. The 2 screens really open up a world of possibilities. It's worth noting that Ayaneo also came out with their own dual screen handheld, and this one's also pretty decent, but I did a head-to-head video earlier this year, and the AYN Thor beat it in just about every single category. And so that's why it's my favorite clamshell handheld of 2025. Okay, 2 more categories before we wrap up. The next is my favorite handheld PC. These are going to be devices that run with the x86 architecture like a laptop or a desktop. And honestly, we didn't have a lot of stellar handheld PC releases this year, but there are 2 that I think are worth noting. The first is the Asus ROG Xbox Ally X. When you get down to it, there's not a huge difference between this one and their previous iterations. It's got the same screen, but with a new chipset, the Z2 Extreme AI, and then it also has these new ergonomic hand grips, which do make it more comfortable. But everything else is largely the same. The controls and the buttons and everything feels exactly like they did last year. The big difference with this one, besides the chipset, is that they've now partnered with Microsoft to come out with their Xbox full screen experience. This is essentially a pared down version of Windows that allows you to jump in and out of your games without having all the overhead from running a Windows desktop. And even though that sounds great in theory, in practice it's been quite a buggy mess. It still feels like a beta release, even though it's been a couple months since it first launched. And so even though the hardware on this device is decent, it still feels like a work in progress, and probably something that will be better in 2026 compared to 2025. There's something to be said about the fact that the Xbox Ally X runs better on a third-party OS called Bazide, which essentially is running SteamOS, compared to the operating system that Microsoft themselves is developing. They're one of the biggest companies in the world, and they're being outclassed by a team of hobbyist developers, and that, I think, says a lot about the current state of the Xbox Ally X. And given the fact that the retail price on this is $1,000, it's quite far from being my top pick of 2025. Instead, my favorite handheld PC of 2025 was kind of unexpected for me. It was the Lenovo Legion Go S. Now, this company released 2 different handheld PCs this year, the Legion Go 2 and the Legion Go S, and multiple SKUs for each. And there's really only one model in particular that I can highly recommend, and it's this one right here, the Z1 Extreme model that runs SteamOS as its primary operating system. So in other words, this is the only handheld besides the Steam Deck that's running SteamOS in an official capacity, and it works really well. well. To put this into context, I reviewed this device earlier this year, and I used a loaner unit from Lenovo, and as soon as I sent it back to them, I missed this thing, and I watched it on Best Buy the entire time, and I waited for a sale, and at one point during Black Friday, it dropped down to $650, which I thought was an excellent price point for this chipset. And I've been loving every minute with this thing since I got it back in my hands. It's got a beautiful 8-inch display that's 120 Hz, and even though it's not OLED, I still think it looks very good in terms of saturation and brightness. But what I really love about it are the overall ergonomics and then also the controls. I think it's got better face buttons and a better D-pad than what you can find on the Steam Deck, which is usually my go-to handheld PC. Now the MSRP for this device is quite high. I think it's around $800 or $900, so I would recommend waiting for a sale. And if you can pick it up around the $650 price point like I did, it's an easy choice as my favorite handheld PC of 2025. There are definitely more powerful handheld PCs out there, but I tend to play more lightweight titles in handheld form factor anyway, and so this one has been an excellent fit even with the older Z1 Extreme chipset. Okay, we're finally at our last category. Let's talk about my favorite overall handheld of 2025. So in this category, I'm basically looking at all the other handhelds that I tried out this year, regardless of their other category, and which one I found to be my own personal favorite. And my honorable mention of this year is the Conquer Pocket Fit for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier in this video. I love this combination of comfort and compatibility and power, and I think it really is an excellent experience overall. It's certainly not perfect. I think the D-pad could be a little bit better, and I did have to swap out the analog sticks for something a bit bigger to really make it feel more comfortable. But after that, yes, it's been excellent. And the main reason why it's not my top pick for this year is because Ioneo has been struggling to fulfill their orders, and it makes me a little bit skeptical of how well they're going to be doing in terms of shipments in the future. However, if you're watching this video at a later date and they are shipping this in a timely manner, then this is an easy recommendation as well if you're looking for something in this horizontal form factor. But when you put it all together, my overall favorite handheld of 2025 was the AYN Thor. It's not often that a handheld comes out that feels like a sea change for the whole community, where all of a sudden we've got these dual screen handhelds that actually work with an Android-based OS. And beyond just being an upscaled version of the original DS and 3DS, this can also be many other things, a multitasking device, or just an excellent little clamshell. I recently went on a trip and it was an easy choice to bring the AYN Thor, even though I've got hundreds of other devices to choose from. And I think that says a lot about the versatility and the high quality components of the AYN Thor. This thing is an absolute pleasure to use. So there you go, those are my favorite handhelds of 2025. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Did you pick up a handheld this year, and was it one of these on the list, or was it something else? And I've also got full in-depth video reviews for all the devices that were featured in this video, so if you want to learn more about them, then I would check out those links in the video description below. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.